The year's 1950. Margaret Sullivan steps out of her front door in Levittown, New York, and within 30 seconds, she's engaged in conversations with three different neighbors. Mrs. Patterson wants to borrow some sugar. Young Tommy Henderson needs help retrieving his baseball from her rose bushes, and Mr. Kowalski is discussing the community barbecue planned for Saturday evening. By the time Margaret reaches the corner store 6 blocks away, she's interacted with 14 neighbors by name, been invited to 2 dinner parties, and promised to help organize the annual block party. Fast forward to today. Sarah Martinez steps out of her apartment building in downtown Denver. She passes 12 people on her way to the coffee shop 3 blocks away. She makes eye contact with none of them. She knows the name of exactly one person in her building, and only because it's written on a package she once accepted for them. When was the last time you had a meaningful conversation with your neighbor? When did you last know their name, their story, their struggles? Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the forgotten histories that shaped our world. If you're watching this from anywhere around the globe, drop a comment below letting us know what time it is, where you are, and which city you're viewing from. Hit that subscribe button because today's journey will fundamentally change how you see the invisible walls we've built around ourselves. And trust me, you won't want to miss where this story leads us. The death of neighborly connection didn't happen overnight. It was murdered slowly, methodically, by forces so gradual and seemingly innocent that we barely noticed the crime taking place. But make no mistake, what we've lost isn't just casual conversation over the fence. We've lost something primal, something that defined human existence for thousands of years, and the consequences are more devastating than you might imagine. Let me take you back to a time when your survival literally depended on knowing your neighbors. Picture colonial America, where barn raisings weren't just quaint traditions, but life or death necessities. When John Peterson's barn burned down in 1847 in Vermont, it wasn't just his family's livelihood at stake. The entire community understood that a family without proper storage would become dependent on others through the harsh winter, straining everyone's resources. Within 48 hours, 37 men showed up with tools, timber, and determination. Women arrived with food that could feed a small army. Children played together while adults worked. By sunset, John had a new barn, but more importantly, he had reaffirmed his place in a web of mutual dependence that made everyone stronger. This wasn't charity. This was survival strategy perfected over generations. Your neighbors were your insurance policy, your entertainment, your news source, your dating pool for your children, your economic partners, and your protection against the unknown dangers lurking beyond your small circle of civilization. But something extraordinary happened in the decades following World War II that began to unravel this ancient social fabric. The year 1947 marked the beginning of what historians now call the Great Suburban Experiment, and it started with a man named William Levitt, who had a radical idea. What if you could mass-produce houses the same way Henry Ford mass-produced automobiles? Levitt purchased 4,000 acres of potato farmland on Long Island and created something the world had never seen. Levittown, the first truly mass-produced suburb. Every house was identical. Cape Cod style, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, built in exactly 27 steps by specialized crews who moved from house to house like an assembly line. A completed home every 16 minutes. Veterans could buy these houses for $58 a month with no money down, cheaper than most people were paying for rent in crowded city apartments. The marketing was genius. Your own home in a park-like community. Space for your children to play safely. A new life away from the noise and dirt of the city. Within 4 years, Levittown housed over 80,000 people. It was the American dream, factory-produced and delivery-ready. But here's what the advertisements didn't mention. Every single homeowner was white. Levitt's contracts explicitly forbade reselling homes to African Americans. This wasn't accidental segregation. It was engineered homogeneity designed to create what planners thought would be perfect communities. And here's the twist that nobody saw coming. This engineered homogeneity actually began to destroy the very concept of community itself. You see, when everyone in your neighborhood has the same income, the same background, the same lifestyle, something psychologically dangerous happens. The beautiful struggle that forged tight community bonds throughout human history disappears. John Peterson needed his neighbors because he genuinely couldn't survive without them. But when everyone can afford their own tools, their own storage, their own entertainment, their own transportation, the necessity that created connection evaporates. Margaret Chen, a sociologist who studied early suburban communities, noticed something strange happening in Levittown by 1955. Despite being surrounded by more families with children than any previous generation had ever experienced, parents were reporting feelings of isolation. "I'm lonelier here than I ever was in our three-room apartment in Brooklyn," one mother confided in Chen's study. "In Brooklyn, Mrs. Goldstein upstairs was always borrowing or lending something. We shared recipes, watched each other's children, complained about our husbands together. Here, everyone's polite, but no one really needs anyone." But the suburban isolation was just the beginning. Three more forces were gathering strength, each one adding another layer to the invisible walls between neighbors. The first was television. In 1950, fewer than 10% of American homes had a television set. By 1960, that number was 87%. Suddenly, the entertainment that used to happen on front porches and in community centers was happening in private living rooms. The shared experience of watching the same shows was actually creating an illusion of connection while destroying real interaction. Robert Putnam, Harvard's famous social scientist, discovered something remarkable when he analyzed data from the early television years. For every hour of television watched per week, there was a corresponding 10% decrease in participation in community activities. People weren't just staying home more, they were becoming passive consumers of entertainment rather than active creators of community life. But television was nothing compared to what came next: air conditioning. This might sound trivial, but follow the logic. Throughout human history, summer evenings were community time. When temperatures soared, people had no choice but to sit on front porches, stoops, and sidewalks, seeking relief in whatever breeze they could find. These weren't planned social gatherings, they were mandatory community meetings forced by climate. Arthur Miller, the famous playwright, wrote beautifully about the summer evenings of his Brooklyn childhood in the 1920s. The whole neighborhood would emerge like flowers in the evening heat. Conversations flowed from stoop to stoop, children ran between the adults like schools of fish, and by the time the temperature finally broke near midnight, you knew more about your neighbors' lives than some families know about each other. Air conditioning changed everything. By 1970, over 70% of new homes came equipped with central air. The front porch conversations moved indoors. The impromptu neighborhood gatherings disappeared. Summer evenings became private, controlled, isolated. Ray Oldenburg, the sociologist who coined the term third place, argued that air conditioning was one of the most community-destructive inventions in human history. "We gained comfort," he wrote, "but we lost connection, and we didn't even realize the trade-off we were making." The third force was the automobile, but not in the way you might think. Cars didn't destroy communities simply by replacing streetcars and buses. The real damage came from what urban planners called distance tolerance. In walking neighborhoods, everything you needed had to be within reasonable distance of your home. Your grocery store, your job, your children's school, your place of worship, your entertainment, all of these were embedded in your immediate community. You didn't choose to interact with neighbors. Interaction was unavoidable. But cars created unprecedented choice. You could work in one town, shop in another, worship in a third, and send your children to school in a fourth. This sounds like freedom, and in many ways it was. But every choice to go elsewhere was a choice not to invest in your immediate surroundings. Consider Jennifer Walsh, a resident of modern suburban Phoenix. She drives 23 minutes to work in Scottsdale, where she has her closest friendships with coworkers. She drives 31 minutes to a grocery store that has the best prices and selection. Her children attend a charter school 19 minutes away that she chose for its academic reputation. The family attends a megachurch 27 minutes away that has the youth programs her teenagers love. She drives 15 minutes to a gym that has the equipment she prefers. Jennifer isn't unusual. She's optimized. She's created a lifestyle where every individual need is met by the best available option. But here's the catch. She has no investment in the place where she actually lives. Her neighbors are just the people who happen to sleep near her. They share no common institutions, no shared daily experiences, no mutual dependence. This is what sociologists call spatial dispersion of social life. And it's a phenomenon that would have been incomprehensible to any previous generation in human history. But the story gets darker because the four forces we've discussed so far were just the opening act. The real destruction of neighborly connection was still to come, and it arrived with a technology that promised to connect us like never before. The year was 1995. The World Wide Web was becoming accessible to ordinary families, and the promises were intoxicating. Global Village. Information Superhighway. Connecting people across the world. The early internet evangelists genuinely believed they were creating tools for unprecedented human connection. Howard Rheingold, one of the pioneering internet researchers, wrote in 1993, "We have the opportunity to revitalize the public sphere, to create new forms of community that transcend geographical boundaries, to build relationships based on shared interests rather than mere proximity." It sounded revolutionary, it sounded like progress, and in some ways it was both. But there was a side effect that nobody anticipated. Dr. Keith Hampton, an internet researcher, conducted a fascinating study in 2001. He compared two groups of suburban residents, those with high-speed internet access and those without. The results were stunning. The connected residents had an average of 2.4 meaningful interactions with neighbors per month. The unconnected residents averaged 8.7. When Hampton interviewed the connected residents, their explanations were remarkably consistent. Why would I make small talk with my neighbor about the weather when I can have deep conversations online with people who share my interests in astronomy? My neighbor and I have nothing in common, but I'm part of 3 online communities where I feel really understood. I get my news online, my entertainment online, my social life online. What do I need neighbors for? This was the birth of what sociologists now call homophily networks, relationships based on similarity rather than proximity. For the first time in human history, you could surround yourself entirely with people who shared your interests, your political views, your lifestyle choices, your sense of humor. It sounds appealing, but there's a psychological trap hidden in homophily networks. And when all of your relationships are based on similarity, you lose something crucial: the ability to navigate difference, to compromise, to find common ground with people who aren't exactly like you. Your neighbor might vote differently than you, but they also might be the person who notices when you haven't picked up your mail for 3 days and checks to make sure you're okay. Real neighbors, the geographical kind, force you to practice democracy in its most fundamental form. Getting along with people you didn't choose, solving problems together despite different backgrounds, building something larger than your individual preferences. But the internet was still just warming up. The real knockout punch came with social media. Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook in 2004 with the mission to make the world more open and connected. The early tagline was "bringing the world closer together." By 2010, people were spending an average of 23 minutes per day on Facebook. By 2020, that number had jumped to 58 minutes daily, and that's just Facebook, not counting Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and the dozens of other platforms competing for our attention. Here's the insidious part. Social media doesn't just compete with neighborly interaction. It actually makes neighborly interaction feel insufficient. When you get home from work, you have a choice. You can walk outside and have a conversation with your next-door neighbor about their garden, their job, their children's school performance. It's pleasant enough, but let's be honest, it's not exactly thrilling. Or you can open your phone and immediately access the funniest people in the world, the most outrageous news stories, the most beautiful photography, the most engaging videos, the most validating likes and comments from people who think you're clever and interesting. It's not a fair competition. Your neighbor's small talk about their commute can't compete with a professionally produced Netflix series. Their concerns about local traffic patterns can't match the global drama unfolding in your Twitter feed. Their invitation to a barbecue feels mundane compared to the virtual party happening in your Instagram stories where everyone looks beautiful and everything looks delicious. But here's what we didn't understand about this trade-off. Those mundane local interactions weren't just pleasantries. They were the immune system of democracy itself. Consider what happened during Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Rebecca Martinez lived in a Manhattan apartment building where she had never spoken to her neighbors. She was a prolific social media user with over 2,000 Facebook friends and 5,000 Twitter followers. When the storm hit and the power went out, she sat alone in the dark for 3 days. She had no idea that the elderly man in apartment 3B had a radio and was tracking the emergency broadcasts. She didn't know that the family in 3C had a camp stove and were sharing hot meals. She wasn't aware that the young couple in 3D were medical students who were checking on vulnerable residents. Rebecca's thousands of online connections were useless. Her phone battery died. The cell towers were down. The people who mattered in that crisis were the ones who happened to live near her, the ones she had never bothered to meet. 2 buildings over, David Chang had a completely different experience. David was old school. He didn't have social media. He had lived in the building for 15 years and knew every resident. When the storm hit, his building became a small civilization. They pooled their resources, checked on each other hourly, shared food and batteries and information. An elderly woman with diabetes got the insulin she needed because David knew she was diabetic, and the nurse in apartment 4A knew how to administer it safely. 2 people, 2 buildings, 2 different approaches to community. Guess who felt safer, more supported, and less traumatized by the disaster? But the digital destruction of neighborliness has an even darker dimension. It's making us physically afraid of each other. Mean World Syndrome, identified by communications researcher George Gerbner, describes how constant exposure to dramatic negative news makes people overestimate danger in their immediate environment. In 1970, 85% of parents allowed their children to walk to school alone. Today, that number is less than 13%, despite the fact that children are statistically safer today than they were in 1970. We're not responding to actual increased danger. We're responding to increased awareness of danger. Your phone delivers a constant stream of kidnappings, murders, assaults, and break-ins from across the globe. Your brain, which evolved to assess threats in a small tribal environment, treats all of this information as if it's happening in your immediate vicinity. The result? You look at your neighbors with suspicion instead of curiosity. You see potential threats instead of potential friends. You install security cameras instead of initiating conversations. You create physical barriers instead of social bridges. This fear-based isolation creates a vicious cycle. The less you know your neighbors, the easier it is to imagine they might be dangerous. The more dangerous they seem, the less likely you are to reach out to them. The less social connection exists in a neighborhood, the less natural surveillance occurs, which actually does make neighborhoods less safe, which confirms your initial suspicions. Maria Gonzalez, a community organizer in Chicago, puts it this way: people will spend $500 on a security system to protect themselves from neighbors they could have met for the cost of a $5 apple pie. But wait, there's more. Because we haven't yet talked about the most recent and perhaps most devastating blow to neighborly connection: the gig economy and remote work. For most of human history, work happened close to home. You were a farmer and your farm was your home. You were a blacksmith and your workshop was attached to your house. You were a merchant and you lived above your shop. Even during the early industrial period, most people worked within walking distance of their homes. This proximity meant that your coworkers were also your neighbors. The boundaries between work life, social life, and community life were blurred, and that blurring created multiple layers of connection. You didn't just work with John, you also lived near John and went to church with John, and your children played with John's children. The commuter culture of the post-war period began to separate work from community, but at least you still had predictable rhythms. You left in the morning, you came home in the evening, you had weekends and evenings to invest in local relationships. But today, everything is fluid. Sarah works from home 3 days a week, freelances for a company in another time zone, drives for Uber on weekends, and sells handmade jewelry on Etsy. Her work life has no geographical center, no consistent rhythm, no built-in social structure. Mike drives for DoorDash during dinner hours because that's when the money is best, which means he's delivering food during precisely the time when previous generations would have been sharing meals with neighbors. Lisa works in a co-working space that's designed to feel like community but is full of people who live in different neighborhoods and are all working for different companies. The flexibility is liberating, but it's also isolating. When your work life has no connection to your geographical location, it becomes much harder to invest in place-based relationships. And then came 2020, when the pandemic forced the largest experiment in social isolation in human history. During the lockdowns, something fascinating happened. People who had lived next to each other for years without speaking suddenly started having conversations across balconies and through windows. Neighborhood WhatsApp groups formed spontaneously. Mutual aid networks emerged to help elderly residents get groceries. Children drew chalk messages on sidewalks for neighbors they had never met. For a brief moment, it seemed like we might rediscover the lost art of neighborliness. But as soon as restrictions lifted, most of these connections dissolved. We had remembered how to be neighbors during crisis, but we couldn't figure out how to be neighbors during normalcy. Dr. Vivek Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General, declared loneliness a public health epidemic in 2023. The research is clear. Chronic loneliness is as dangerous to your health as smoking 15 cigarettes per day. It increases your risk of heart disease, depression, anxiety, dementia, and early death. It weakens your immune system and disrupts your sleep patterns. But here's the really disturbing part. We're not just becoming lonelier. We're losing the skills necessary to form new relationships. Sociologists call it social atrophy, and it's particularly pronounced among younger generations who have grown up with digital-first social lives. 22-year-old Emma Thompson recently moved into her first apartment. She wants to meet her neighbors, but she literally doesn't know how. Do I just knock on their door? What if they're busy? What would I even say? It feels so weird and intrusive, she explains. Emma can navigate complex online gaming communities, manage multiple social media personalities, and maintain long-distance relationships through video calls. But the simple act of introducing herself to the person who lives 20 feet away feels impossibly complicated. This social atrophy isn't just an individual problem. It's a threat to democracy itself. Democracy requires citizens who can discuss difficult topics with people they disagree with, find compromise solutions to complex problems, and maintain social trust even during conflict. These are skills that you learn through practice, through daily interaction with a diverse group of people who happen to share your physical space. When all of your relationships are optional and similarity-based, you never develop the democratic muscles necessary to navigate difference constructively. You can simply unfriend, unfollow, or block anyone who challenges your worldview. But you can't unfriend your neighbor who puts up political signs you hate, so you have to figure out how to coexist despite disagreement. The consequences of our neighborly disconnection are showing up everywhere. Declining trust in institutions, increasing political polarization, weakening social safety nets, rising mental health challenges, and the collapse of what sociologists call social capital. The networks of relationships that make communities resilient and functional. But the story doesn't have to end here. Because scattered across the globe, small groups of people are quietly conducting experiments in rebuilding neighborly connection, and their results are absolutely remarkable. In Barcelona, Spain, architect Ana Torres was tired of living anonymously in her apartment building. She convinced her building's management to install a community bulletin board in the lobby and organize a monthly potluck dinner in the courtyard. Within 6 months, the building had transformed from 24 isolated units into a genuine small community. Residents now share tools, babysit each other's children, coordinate group grocery purchases, and provide support during emergencies. But Torres didn't stop there. She helped other buildings in her neighborhood start similar programs, and now entire city blocks are connected through overlapping networks of micro-communities. Crime has dropped. Social services report fewer calls for elderly welfare checks, and local businesses are thriving because residents are more likely to shop locally when they feel connected to their area. In Portland, Oregon, architect Mark Lakeman created something called intersection repair. His organization helps neighborhoods transform unused intersection spaces into community gathering places. They install little free libraries, community tool exchanges, bulletin boards, and seating areas. The magic happens not in the infrastructure itself, but in the excuse it provides for neighbors to interact around shared projects. One intersection repair in the Richmond neighborhood led to 23 new neighborhood friendships, the creation of a community garden, a neighborhood watch program, and a weekly outdoor movie night during summer months. The project cost less than $500 but generated social connections that residents valued at over $50,000 in terms of childcare exchanges, tool sharing, and mutual support. In Seoul, South Korea, urban planner Jenny Kim recognized that apartment buildings were creating vertical neighborhoods where people lived 30 feet away from each other but never met. She designed a simple intervention: shared activity spaces on alternating floors. Instead of every floor being identical, floors 2, 4, and 6 have laundry facilities, floors 3, 5, and 7 have children's play areas, and the ground floor has a community kitchen. The result? Residents have to use shared spaces regularly, which creates natural opportunities for interaction. Children from different families play together while parents do laundry and naturally start conversations. The community kitchen hosts informal potluck dinners where residents share food from their various cultural backgrounds. Kim's buildings report 78% higher resident satisfaction scores and 43% longer average tenancy compared to traditional apartment buildings. People don't just live there. They choose to stay because they've found community. But perhaps the most interesting experiments are happening digitally. Nextdoor, the neighborhood-focused social media platform, was designed specifically to recreate local connection in digital form. When it works well, it becomes a tool for organizing block parties, sharing recommendations for local services, coordinating disaster response, and building genuine relationships that translate into offline interaction. The key difference between Nextdoor and other social platforms is verification and locality. You have to prove you live where you say you live, and you can only connect with people in your immediate geographic area. This creates accountability. You can't just troll people and disappear because you might run into them at the grocery store tomorrow. However, Nextdoor also reveals how much we've lost in terms of local social skills. Many neighborhoods report that Nextdoor conversations devolve into arguments about parking, noise, politics, and pet behavior. People who might be perfectly pleasant in face-to-face conversations become hostile when mediated by screens and keyboards. The successful Nextdoor neighborhoods have learned to use the platform primarily for organizing offline activities, use group walks, hobby clubs, skill shares, and community improvement projects. The digital tool becomes a means to an end rather than an end in itself. But technology alone won't solve the neighborliness crisis. The real solutions require intentional changes in how we design communities, structure our daily lives, and prioritize our time and attention. Urban planners are rediscovering principles that create what they call neighboring potential. Wide sidewalks with places to pause and chat. Front porches instead of private back decks. Mixed-use development that puts retail spaces within walking distance of residential areas. Public spaces like parks and plazas that draw people out of their homes. Transit systems that create shared experiences instead of isolated car commutes. The city of Copenhagen has become a global model for neighbor-friendly urban design. Their concept of cozy extends beyond personal comfort to community connection. Neighborhoods are designed around bicycle transportation, which means people move through their communities at human speed with opportunities for spontaneous interaction. Public spaces include features like communal fire pits, outdoor exercise equipment, and community gardens. Copenhagen residents report some of the highest levels of neighborhood satisfaction and social trust in the world. They've proven that urban density doesn't have to mean isolation. Properly designed density can actually enhance community connection. But individual choices matter just as much as urban planning. Every single day, each of us makes dozens of small decisions that either contribute to or detract from neighborhood connection. When you need a cup of sugar, do you run to the store or ask a neighbor? When you see someone struggling with heavy groceries, do you offer to help or pretend not to notice? When your neighbor's dog barks incessantly, do you call the landlord or have a conversation? When you're planning a weekend project, do you ask neighbors if they want to borrow tools or might be interested in helping? These micro-choices seem trivial individually, but they aggregate into the social fabric that either binds communities together or leaves them fragmented. Dr. Susan Pinker, author of The Village Effect, argues that neighborhood connections are particularly crucial for children and elderly people. Children who grow up knowing their neighbors develop stronger social skills, higher emotional intelligence, and greater resilience. They have more adults invested in their well-being, more diverse role models, and a stronger sense of belonging to something larger than their immediate family. For elderly people, neighborhood connections are literally life-saving. Seniors with strong neighborhood ties live longer, maintain cognitive function better, and require fewer social services. They have built-in support systems for small daily challenges and rapid response networks for emergencies. But neighborhood connection benefits every age group. Adults with strong neighbor relationships report higher levels of life satisfaction, lower levels of stress, greater sense of safety, and more opportunities for personal growth through skill sharing and collaboration. The mental health implications alone should make neighborly connection a policy priority. Communities with high levels of social cohesion have lower rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and suicide. They have higher levels of economic mobility, educational achievement, and civic participation. This isn't just correlation, it's causation. Social connection creates psychological resilience that helps individuals weather challenges and access opportunities. A neighbor might tell you about a job opening, help you through a difficult divorce, provide childcare during emergencies, or simply offer the daily social interaction that keeps depression at bay. Yet, most of us continue to live as if neighbors are an optional extra rather than a fundamental necessity for human flourishing. The path forward isn't about returning to some imaginary golden age of community. We can't uninvent cars or air conditioning or the internet, nor should we want to. The question is how to preserve the benefits of modern technology while intentionally rebuilding the social connections that make life meaningful and communities resilient. It starts with recognizing that neighborly connection isn't something that happens naturally in our current environment. It requires the same kind of intentional effort that we put into career development, physical fitness, or financial planning. We need to schedule time for neighborhood connection, create systems that support it, and measure our success in building it. It means making different choices about where to live, prioritizing neighborhoods with walking potential over those with the largest houses. It means spending time in front yards instead of backyards, on front porches instead of in media rooms. It means shopping locally even when it's less convenient, walking or biking instead of driving when possible, and choosing community activities over individual entertainment. Most importantly, it requires overcoming the awkwardness barrier. Yes, it feels weird to introduce yourself to neighbors you've lived near for months or years without speaking. Yes, it's uncomfortable to have conversations with people who might not share your interests or background. Yes, it's easier to stay isolated in your private bubble. But the alternative is a society of strangers, a community of loneliness, a democracy without the social trust necessary to function. The alternative is the world we're currently creating, where children grow up without knowing how to navigate difference, where elderly people die alone and undiscovered for weeks, where communities fall apart during crises because no one knows anyone else. The choice is ours, and we make it new every single day through 1,000 small decisions about how to spend our time, where to focus our attention, and whether to reach out across the small but increasingly vast distances that separate us from the people who happen to share our piece of the world. Your neighbors are still there, behind their closed doors and privacy fences and digital screens. They're dealing with the same challenges you are: loneliness, stress, uncertainty about the future, desire for authentic connection. They're probably just as hungry for community as you are, just as unsure of how to bridge the gap, just as worried about appearing intrusive or strange. Someone has to make the first move. Someone has to be willing to look foolish, to risk rejection, to invest time and energy in relationships that might not immediately pay off. Throughout human history, that someone has been ordinary people who understood that community doesn't happen by accident. The great neighborly disconnection wasn't inevitable, and it isn't permanent. It was created by human choices, and it can be undone by different human choices. The question isn't whether we can rebuild community in the modern world, but whether we will choose to do the simple, difficult work required to reconnect with the people who live closest to us. That work starts today with your next decision to walk outside, knock on a door, introduce yourself to someone whose name you should have learned months ago, and begin the slow, essential process of remembering how to be neighbors. The future of community is being written right now, in small conversations across front yard fences, in community gardens planted on vacant lots, in neighbors who choose to know each other's names. Professor Archive will continue exploring the hidden histories that shape our world, but this story is still being written, and you are one of its authors. Before you go, remember to subscribe to Professor Archive. If this journey through the hidden history of neighborhood connection opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered before, drop a comment below, letting us know what time it is, where you are, and which city you're viewing from, and tell us about your own neighborhood. Do you know your neighbors' names? When did you last have a meaningful conversation with someone who lives near you? What's one small step you could take this week to begin rebuilding community where you live? The story of why we don't know our neighbors anymore doesn't have to be the end of neighborliness itself, but the beginning of choosing differently.